For over 400 years, one woman has stood at the crossroads of legend and horror. A noblewoman accused of torturing and killing hundreds. A woman said to bathe in the blood of virgins. A woman immortalized as the most prolific female serial killer in history. But behind the chilling tales lies a deeper, more complicated truth. Today, we peel back the layers of myth, propaganda, and fear to uncover what history really tells us about Elizabeth Báthory, the so-called Blood Countess. This is Myth versus Fact, the Elizabeth Báthory story re-examined. Who was Elizabeth Báthory? Early life before marriage. Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 in Nyírbátor, Hungary, into the powerful and influential Bathory family, one of the great aristocratic houses of Central Europe. Her father was Baron George VI Bathory of the X branch, and her mother was Baroness Anna Bathory, the daughter of Stephen Bathory of Somlyo. The family's lineage produced princes of Transylvania, military commanders, high-ranking nobles and statesmen, even a future king of Poland. From birth, Elizabeth was surrounded by privilege, political authority, and enormous expectations. Elizabeth grew up during a time of intense political instability. The Ottoman Empire regularly threatened Hungarian territories. Protestant and Catholic tensions shaped alliances. Noble families competed for influence and control. The Bathorys were deeply involved in all of this. Their estates, soldiers, and political reach made them one of the dominant forces in the region. Elizabeth's childhood wasn't just noble, it was strategically important. She was raised to represent a dynasty. Unlike most girls of her time, Elizabeth received an elite education designed for members of ruling families. She became fluent in Latin, German, and Hungarian, skilled in reading, writing, and formal correspondence, trained in mathematics and basic sciences, taught estate management, preparing her to oversee vast lands, exposed to the philosophy, religion, and court etiquette, expected of nobility. Her intelligence was noted even by contemporaries. At a time when many noble women were barely taught to read, Elizabeth was multilingual and highly literate. Elizabeth's family was known not only for political power, but also for strong personalities and unusual interests. Her relatives included military leaders hardened by battles. With the Ottoman Empire, scholars and politicians were involved in regional rule. An uncle known for studying alchemy and the occult. An aunt rumored to be fiercely independent and influential in noble circles. Elizabeth grew up surrounded by ideas, power, and intellectual curiosity, a combination that shaped her into a confident, assertive young woman. Elizabeth likely suffered childhood epilepsy, then called the falling sickness. Medicine in the 1500s was primitive and treatment blurred the line between science and superstition. Medicine was primitive and filled with superstition. Herbs, bloodletting, prayers, and folk cures. From a young age, Elizabeth was trained to run huge noble households. She enforced discipline on dozens of servants and managed farms, money, and supplies. She also learned how to move and speak like a high-ranking noblewoman. The Bathory estates were more than homes. They were economic and political hubs. By her early teens, Elizabeth helped run family lands and moved in noble court circles. She already represented her family's interests in social and legal matters. Before the scandals, Elizabeth was known as an educated aristocrat. She was politically valuable, trained for authority, and lived in a violent borderland. These traits, intelligence, influence, and independence, later made her an easy target for suspicion, jealousy, and political maneuvering by rivals. Her marriage to Count Ferenc Nadasdy wasn't just romantic. It was a power deal between two of the richest dynasties. In Hungary, their wedding in 1575 drew thousands of noble guests. Ferenc was already earning fame as a brutal war hero on the Ottoman front. He spent years fighting along the Ottoman frontier, a brutal border war where mercy was rare and survival demanded violence. Known to his enemies as the Black Knight of Hungary, Ferenc earned his reputation through relentless campaigns, raids, and sieges against Ottoman forces. This was a world of burned villages, shifting borders, and constant bloodshed, a place where cruelty was not only accepted but rewarded. As part of the marriage, Elizabeth received Countess Castle and its surrounding villages, a lonely border fortress guarding the western frontier, a stronghold that would later become infamous. Ferenc's long absences at war left Elizabeth in charge of their estates, while the violence of the frontier seeped back into noble life. In this era, brutality wasn't an aberration. It was a skill and a symbol of power. While Ferenc spent years away at war, she ruled this stone stronghold, almost like a queen in her own small kingdom, signing documents, managing justice, and controlling the lives of everyone who lived in its shadow. And here is where the historical record begins to darken. Stories say she tortured young servant girls in the hidden rooms of Countess Castle, whipping, burning, mutilation, starvation, punishments turning into slow, deliberate torture. The legend, Elizabeth Báthory, according to the most lurid tales, screams, echoed through the stone corridors at night, and servants vanished from the castle one by one, explained away as runaways who never returned. And then comes the most shocking myth of all, whispered by villagers and later repeated in books and films, that Elizabeth murdered virgins and bathed in their blood to stay young and beautiful. Not just a killer, but a kind of twisted alchemist, hunting for eternal youth. These stories turned her into a prototype of the female vampire, an aristocratic predator hiding behind silk and jewels, inspiring centuries of horror novels, movies, and dark folklore. But how much of this nightmare is actually true? Are we looking at a real serial killer, or a legend carefully crafted to destroy a powerful woman? Before we break down the evidence, let's lay out the key myths that built the Blood Countess story. Not a single line in the original trial record says Elizabeth bathed in blood. That detail appears centuries later, added by storytellers and penny dreadful writers. In the real documents, there are beatings and dead servants, but no satanic spa sessions. So where did the bloodbath image come from? From writers needing a monster even worse than the truth. The famous number 650 comes from one piece of hearsay. A servant claimed that a woman kept a list of victims. No list was ever found. No mass graves matching that number were discovered. Investigators did find dead and injured servants at the castle, but the body count we can actually prove is far, far lower. So, if the 650 is a myth, what can we really say about how many died inside Countess Castle? None of the surviving testimonies accuse Elizabeth of drinking blood. 0. The vampire stuff was pasted onto her legend later, once Gothic novels and Dracula-style stories became popular. In other words, she didn't inspire vampires. Vampire fiction reached back in time and claimed her. So how did an ordinary human countess get upgraded into Europe's ultimate female vampire? The famous scene where soldiers smash open the doors and find Elizabeth splattered with blood standing over fresh corpses isn't in the records. Contemporary reports describe something much calmer. A planned, controlled arrest carried out in a noble household, not a horror movie massacre. Yes, witnesses later spoke of mistreated and even dead servants at the castle, but the caught red-handed in a slaughter room moment was added long after to make the story unforgettable. If the real arrest was quieter and more political than the films suggest, who actually created this over-the-top version of events? Elizabeth was not painted as a one-woman killing machine. In her own time, 4 of her closest servants were tried as accomplices, and 2 were executed in brutal fashion. That tells us authorities saw this not as a solitary maniac, but as a household system of abuse. And remember, Almost all of the testimony against her was collected torture or threat of execution. So were these servants exposing a monstrous mistress or saying whatever the court needed to hear to save themselves? When we strip away the later vampire stories, we're left with something more complicated and, in some ways, even more disturbing. A powerful noblewoman, a stream of dead and abused servants, and a trial shaped by politics, torture, and fear. Now let's step out of the legend and look at what the historical evidence actually shows. The historical facts: old manuscripts, court transcripts, castle reconstructions. Here's what the records do show. People complained. Servants, neighbors, even minor nobles described. A household ruled by fear. Beatings, ice baths, harsh winter punishments at a time when violence against servants was already normal for the nobility. And yet Elizabeth's discipline was remembered as worse. But there's a catch. Most of this testimony was taken under torture or the threat of execution. When your choice is confess something or die slowly, how reliable is your story? So we're left with chilling accusations and a giant question mark hanging over how much of it we can actually trust. The most famous image of Elizabeth Báthory is the one thing the early sources never mention: bathing in blood. The bloodbath detail first appears in print in 1729 in a dramatic history written more than a century after she died. The original witness accounts, finally published in 1817, don't include it. So her most iconic crime was literally patched on later, by writers, not by the people who actually investigated her. If the grisliest part of the legend is a retrofit, what else about the story has been rewritten for effect? Strip away the horror movie numbers, and historians think we're looking at perhaps a few dozen suspicious deaths over many years, not 650. Letters between nobles complain about girls disappearing. Local rumors talk about bodies quietly buried near the castle. Officials who work for the family admitted that many servants had died unnaturally. Is that horrifying? Yes. Is it the industrial scale slaughter that later legend claims? No. The real picture is slower, messier, and more ambiguous. A powerful household where servants were disposable and sometimes never came back. Here's one of the strangest twists. Elizabeth Báthory was never put on public trial as a high-ranking noblewoman. She was handled offstage. Her 4 closest servants were the ones dragged into court, interrogated, and executed. Their confessions, taken under brutal pressure, became the proof against her. The King of Hungary wanted her executed, but the powerful Bathory clan pushed back, killing her outright, starting a noble feud. So they chose a compromise. Elizabeth was sealed inside rooms of her own castle, windows partly bricked up, fed through a slot, and left there until she died in 1614. No courtroom speech, no verdict read aloud, just a quiet, permanent disappearance. Now the part most horror stories skip: the politics. The Bathory family controlled vast lands and serious money. The king owed Elizabeth a large unpaid debt for funding his armies. If she could be erased as a criminal, much of that wealth could be seized or redistributed. So ask yourself, if you're a king drowning in war expenses, and there's a widowed countess who is rich, powerful, and hard to control, how tempting is it to turn her into the villain of the century? Modern historians are split. Some think she was a sadistic abuser who absolutely killed many girls. Others argue she was framed or exaggerated into a monster to wipe out a political problem. Either way, one thing is clear: the blood countess we know today isn't just a woman from history. She's the result of fear, power, debt, and rumor all stitched together over 400 years. And that's where your final section can go. From what really happened at Cactus Castle to why do we want women like Elizabeth Báthory to be monsters in our stories? Was she really a serial killer? So what is the truth? Most modern historians fall into two main camps. Theory 1. Elizabeth as a ruthless noblewoman whose cruelty escalated to murder violence against servants in the 1500s was common, often brutal and rarely punished. This theory says the legend grew out of something very real, but smaller and uglier than the myth, everyday abuse that slowly turned deadly. Maybe the truth is more ordinary and more depressing than the vampire stories. Theory 2. Elizabeth as the target of a political hit. Supporters of this view point to testimonies pulled from people under torture, the lack of hard physical evidence, and records that contradict each other. Then they look at motive. The king owed Elizabeth a huge debt for military support. If she became a criminal, much of her land and wealth could be seized. The church also gained by weakening a powerful Protestant family. From this angle, the case looks less like justice and more like a carefully orchestrated takedown. Elizabeth Báthory is not a monster here, but the victim of a very successful conspiracy. A third, middle position sits between those extremes. In that version, Elizabeth was a brutal, abusive aristocrat who really did harm people, but later, politicians, priests, and storytellers inflated her into something much worse, a real woman whose crimes were amplified, decorated, and twisted until she became the Blood Countess. The same facts can be read in completely different ways. For some, they reveal a hidden serial killer. For others, they show the fingerprints of a political frame job. We do not have photographs, forensic files, or taped confessions. All we have are letters, rumors, power, struggles, and words spoken under pain of death. So in the end, Elizabeth Báthory lives somewhere between crime and legend. Was she a sadistic killer, a convenient scapegoat, or something in between? The records are there. The myths are loud. You have to decide which version you believe. Myth versus fact breakdown. Here is a direct side-by-side summary. Myth: she killed 650 girls. Fact: that number is unverified. Realistic estimates are closer to 20 to 80 possible deaths. Myth: she was a vampiric killer who drank blood. Fact: there is no evidence in the original records of blood drinking or vampire-like rituals. Myth: she was caught red-handed in a room full of bodies. Fact: contemporary reports do not describe this dramatic scene. It was added in later retellings. Myth: she was pure, inhuman evil. Fact: politics, debt, and religious conflict heavily shaped the case against her and the legend that followed. Her death and legacy. Elizabeth Báthory died in 1614, still confined inside her own castle, and no trial, no verdict, no public execution. Her family buried her quietly, first in a local church crypt. Villagers protested, refusing to share sacred ground with her remains, and the body was moved again, even in death. She was unwanted. Over the centuries, the story escaped the archives and entered folklore. Each retelling added more blood, more bodies, more horror, until the woman at the center was almost erased, replaced by a monster. But when the myths are stripped away, what remains is something more unsettling than fiction. A powerful aristocrat in a violent age. A justice system shaped by torture and politics. A society eager for monsters, especially when a woman holds power. Elizabeth Báthory may have been cruel. She may have been guilty. She may also have been exaggerated into something far worse than the truth. What we do know is this: her legend grew faster than evidence could survive. And 400 years later, we are still trying to separate history from the stories we wanted to believe. So who was Elizabeth Báthory? A serial killer? A scapegoat? Or a powerful noblewoman crushed by politics, fear, and rumor? The truth lives somewhere in the shadow between myth and fact. If you enjoyed this deep historical investigation, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which legend, mystery, or a historical figure you'd like me to explore next. Thank you for watching. And remember, history is never as simple as the stories we inherit.